Greetings, friends, and welcome to Contemplative Light in our world. And we have a very special guest today, Carl McColman, and I think you will all probably, most of you may be familiar with him, so it's an honor to have him on the show. I wanted to give a heads up that I also have a book out called Preparation for Great Light, Recollections of a Christian Mystic by Clint Sabom on Amazon, and you can check that out. I'll put a link below in the show notes. And Contemplative Light also has sayings of mystics in a kind of short book that I think you all would enjoy, and I'll put a link to that too in the show notes. And with all that having said, Carl McColman, welcome to the podcast. An honor to have you here.
Oh, it's a delight to be here, Clint. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, we've kind of been friends on Facebook for a while, but never formally connected. So this is great getting to see you. And I guess just do you want to give a just kind of a brief background of your spiritual path and what your work is, just in case some listeners may not be familiar with you?
Sure. So I am, um, well, I'm a writer. I guess writing is how I got into this. Well, obviously, my own practice. I've been engaged in contemplative practice since the mid 1980s, so about 40 years now. I did my graduate work at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. So up there, I became connected with the Shalem Institute, and it was through Shalem that I discovered spiritual direction and that I discovered contemplative prayer. So obviously in a Christian context, but Shalem, of course, has deep roots in interspirituality and the kind of encounter between Christian mysticism and Tibetan Buddhism. So kind of baked in from the beginning was a deep respect for the Dharma and for interspirituality in general. You know, my life had many twists and turns. We don't need to go into all of that, but I did spend the season taking a pretty deep dive into pagan spirituality, goddess spirituality, that kind of thing, Celtic spirituality, both pre-Christian and Christian. Eventually found myself really exploring more of the Catholic side of the Christian world. Became affiliated with the Trappist monks. There's a Trappist monastery here in Georgia. I became a lay associate of that monastery about 12 years ago. And it was in that context that my writing career really developed. I was given the tremendous opportunity to write a book about Christian mysticism. It came out in 2010, called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism. Don't tease me about the title. I think it's a silly title, but there you go. That's the name of the book. And then more recently, we had the second edition, which is called The New Big Book of Christian Mysticism, and a few other books along the way. And then it's just been really kind of following my heart, following where the spirit leads me. So I now I do one-on-one spiritual direction. I have a blog. I had a podcast for a number of years, although we're pretty much, I guess, semi-retired now, but who knows? There might be more episodes in the future. And and then I do retreats and that kind of thing as well. So I'm very, very, kind of honored to be kind of doing contemplative work more or less on a full-time basis. It's just a great joy. So
That's fantastic. And, as far as the big book of Christian mysticism, that may be how a lot of people come, familiar with you at first.
mhm.
What's different about the new big book of Christian mysticism from the older one?
Well, to begin with, it's a lot longer. It is, several friends of mine have teased me, well, why didn't you call it the even bigger book of Christian mysticism? And to which my reply was, well, the first edition wasn't really that big to begin with. The second edition is kind of sort of getting into big territory, but it's about 100,000 words longer. And if you kind of know manuscripts, that's like I've added an entire book to it. So about 100 extra pages of new material. Of course, the existing material was thoroughly revised. And it really just reflects, I guess, my own journey over the last 12 to 15 years. Still very much grounded in the Christian tradition, but I think my the interspiritual dimension of my own faith has definitely broadened in the last 15 years. So I think there's, a sense of that, but also a much stronger commitment to what the Jesuits call being a contemplative in action. So looking at kind of the activist side of the spiritual life, spirituality and justice, spirituality and eroticism, spirituality and art and creativity, those kinds of topics kind of show up. And then there were just some little details that I felt like the first book didn't really address as well, and I tried to do a better job in the second book. I think I really glossed over the Jewish contribution to Christian mysticism in the first book, so I tried to take a deeper dive there in the new book. And also be just a little bit more acknowledging that there are a diversity of voices within the Christian tradition. Many of the mystics, I guess, that I really explored beginning in college we're very much out of the European tradition. And certainly, the European voices still dominate in the history of Christian mysticism, but I've tried to bring in voices from other parts of the world as well. So those are just a few of the highlights in the new book.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I believe you have a new one coming out soon as well. Read the Bible like a mystic. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. That will be out next May, I believe, is what we settled on, May of 2025. The book is written, it's in production right now. So the title is Read the Bible Like a Mystic, Contemplation and the Word. And it's a funny story behind how I was inspired to write that book. I was actually on a video podcast shortly after the first big book came out. And I was with a person who is actually a pastor, is a minister within the Christian tradition, has a podcast, invited me on. The theme of the podcast was listening to God or something like that. So it wasn't really a contemplative or a mystical oriented podcast, but it kind of fit the theme. So they brought me on, interviewed me for about 20 minutes. And at the end of the interview, the the host said to me, "Now, what is the one book you would recommend to people if they want to learn more about Christian mysticism?" Now, in retrospect, I realize he was pitching me to promote my own book, but marketing is not my long suit. So that went right over my head. And I took him at his word. I said, "Oh, of course it would be the Bible." And he looked at me like I just sprouted a second head. And he said, "The
Good.
Bible?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely. The Bible is a profoundly mystical document." Well, this poor person who again is a pastor. I assume he's still out there. I haven't talked to him in years. That just he was totally nonplussed. That just completely, was off his radar. And it just got me to thinking that I think in institutional Christianity, the Bible is not read as a mystical document. It is
Mhm.
read, it's read as a historical document, obviously as a moral document. And, I think for many people, the Bible is just, they see it as access to God's will or something like that. Was it there's a bumper sticker, BIBLE, basic instructions before leaving Earth, which is terrible theology, but hey, people have it. And so, I realized that there is this entire dimension of, kind of a historical understanding, a hermeneutic, to use a fancy word, a way of interpreting the Bible, way of reading the Bible that I think has many ways been sidelined in the last few centuries. So this book is my attempt to kind of invite people to rediscover some of those ancient, ways of reading the text. It's not a commentary. I don't go through book by book by book. It's certainly not a book of scholarship. I have no credentials to be a Bible scholar. So it is written from a practitioner's perspective, somebody for whom, the spiritual life is meaningful. And whether they're a Christian and they believe the Bible is the Word of God, or even if they're not a Christian, but they recognize that the Bible is a sacred text for Christians, I think either of those doorways into the text can be meaningful. So I don't try to promote one particular way of interpreting the book, but I do try to give people some tools so that they can encounter the text and their own heart can engage with the wisdom that's in there. And then the other side is kind of, just being really, responsive to the moment that we find ourselves in. I do believe that there is a trend among some Christians to weaponize the Bible and to use the Bible to kind of promote barriers, spiritual barriers, who's in and who's out, what is the role of women in the church? What is the role of LGBTQ persons in the spiritual life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a terrible misuse of the Bible. Like I said, it's a weaponization of the text. So I also make the case that one of the gifts of reading the Bible mystically is that it deconstructs some of the wrong ways that the Bible is read and used in our culture.
That's fantastic. And that seems like a very necessary thing to do. I mean, especially in our culture, which you mentioned, in the weaponization of the Bible, it can be merciless. And I think not only do most people not read the Bible as mystics, I don't think most mystics read the Bible as mystics.
Maybe today. I think historically they did. I think you can look at whether it's Saint Benedict or Ignatius of Loyola, Julian of Norwich, John of the Cross. So many of the great Christian mystics were steeped in the Bible, and it's a mixed bag because there is certainly, figures from 500 or 1,000 years ago read the Bible with the tools that were accessible to them. So it's what we would call a pre-modern way of reading the Bible. They didn't have access to the kind of historical or critical scholarship that we have today. And, it's interesting. My wife and I were talking about this morning on our morning walk. And we're talking about, why institutional Christianity is in crisis right now. And I don't know if you've discussed this on your podcast or not, but most people recognize that churches are losing members, membership is dwindling, it's aging. Young people are just not interested in the institution anymore. And I do think that the institution itself is largely to blame for that. And so what I was saying to my wife is that we have this situation where Christianity as an institution, as a movement, was blindsided by the scientific revolution and blindsided by the rise of, kind of modernity, the ways of thinking, the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, not the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, but the Western Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, looking to see the world kind of in a materialistic way. And I think Christianity made the terrible mistake of kind of circling the wagons. And that's most obvious with the rise of fundamentalism. I think a lot of people don't realize that fundamentalism is really a modern movement. Great mystics in the third and fourth century, Origen of Alexandria, for example, used to say, reading the text literally is only one of many possible ways to read the text. And it's fascinating to me that we have a whole generation of Christians today that have not gotten that memo. But so this kind of fundamentalist, reading the text in a very naive, literalistic way without access to historical critical scholarship is kind of Christianity being defensive against the scientific revolution. And I think that the contemplative tradition would say to the scientific revolution, hey, guess what? You're right. The world was not created in 6 days. There was no flood that covered the entire surface of the earth. That would be, geologically impossible. Let's just call a spade and say that the stories in scripture are by and large mythological stories. But again, not interpreting myth in the kind of, skeptical way of saying, well, a myth is just a fairy tale, but in that kind of almost Jungian way, that kind of deeply mythopoetic way of saying that a myth is a story that may or may not be historical, but that conveys significant spiritual wisdom. And if we can bring that approach not only to scripture, but to the entirety of how we do spirituality, I think it would breathe some new life into Christianity. I'm sure you're familiar with the line from Karl Rahner, the Jesuit theologian, who said, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. And, that has been kind of, my motto for, years now, and really was the guiding quotation that both editions of my book were built around. And so this idea, and again, mysticism is not unique to Christianity, but Christian mysticism is a flavor of the mystical life, and it has its own distinct beauty and its own distinct way to move into non-duality and to move into divine union. So it would break my heart to see Christian mysticism disappear. Now, institutional Christianity, that's another story. But I think that for the survival, if institutional Christianity is going to survive, it needs to reconnect with its mystical heart, and it needs to do so really, really fast. And again, the key to that, I think, is contemplative practice and learning to engage not only with the Bible, but indeed with theology, with that kind of mythopoetic perspective.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think that's a great service. It's just a really great service. And yes, I'm on the same page with everything you just said. Now, I'll throw out one thing and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but it seems like I read somewhere where you were into paganism before
Mhm,
Christian
mhm,
mysticism. Could you
mhm,
say a little
mhm.
bit about that?
Yeah, yeah, I mentioned that earlier, so you picked up on that. For about 7 or 8 years, I took a pretty deep dive into kind of the neo-pagan world, and and eventually realized that it wasn't my home base. My home base, for better or for worse, is the Christian tradition. But I still have tremendous affection for, I guess, what I would call kind of indigenous spiritualities all around the world, whether you're talking about Shinto in Japan or, traditional African religions, Celtic spirituality, pre-Christian Celtic spirituality, Wicca, which is actually a very modern religion, a 20th century religion, but is inspired by ancient European paganism. So, and so the list goes on. Native American spirituality, there's so many different expressions. And so what all of these have in common is usually a deep sense of the reverence of the natural world. To use mystical language, they are nature mystics. But then also either polytheism or, at the very least, a profound sense of the divinest feminine. So goddess spirituality, you could say. And I think I first got interested in pagan spirituality because I just had a real yearning in my heart for the feminine face of the divine. And I think in the 1980s, at least in the circles I moved in, maybe if I lived in San Francisco, it would be different. But in the circles I moved in, Christianity just hadn't quite gotten the memo about the feminine face of God yet. And so I just became interested. I had several friends who were exploring Wicca and other forms of paganism. I became interested in it myself, read some books, met some people, began to participate in some, pagan ceremonies, and really found it quite compelling. And so, it's interesting. Ken Wilbur, the transpersonal integral theorist, he's kind of distanced himself from transpersonal, but the integral theorist talks about kind of four dimensions to mysticism: the natural mysticism, deity mysticism, formless mysticism, and non-dual mysticism. I don't entirely see things eye to eye with Ken, but I do think it's kind of a useful taxonomy. And so, kind of traditional Christian spirituality, the spirituality of Julian of Norwich, of Teresa of Avila, of John of the Cross, certainly are examples of that deity mysticism. Whereas, what we tend to think of as paganism or neo-paganism would be a beautiful example of nature mysticism, although you do find that in the Christian world too. Think about Hildegard of Bingen or Francis of Assisi, or in our day, even Teilhard de Chardin. So, so that whole kind of nature, deity, formless, non-dual, it needs to be seen as kind of a spectrum, not as like four boxes, and which box do you fit into? But I think the mystical life in its fullness really kind of invites us into that entire spectrum. And mysticism begins in the body, it begins in the earth, it begins in the soil. And so the nature mystics really honor that and celebrate that and find the reverence in, in creation, whether you believe in a creator or not. I think it's beautiful to speak of the natural world as creation. And so then, then through myth and through story and through the intuitions of our heart, we begin to discern the mystery that's even bigger than what can be measured, by scientific instruments. And I think that's when we begin to encounter this idea of the deity. But then, look at Meister Eckhart, the great German mystic, Dominican mystic from the 13th century, 13th, 14th century, or he died in what, 1327. He said that there is a God beyond God, or a Godhead beyond God. And this moves into what Wilbur calls that kind of formless mysticism, the God that cannot be contained by language, that cannot be contained by human words. Many people chafe against the word God or even the word spirit. It's like they're too limiting. God is embedded in gender, but God isn't just a boy or a girl. I have a t-shirt, I just got it, that said God is non-binary. And I love that, this idea that God holds the whole spectrum of gender and the whole spectrum of human knowledge and wisdom. And, any archetype we can come up, God is Father, God is King, God is Lord, God is Savior. All those are our archetypes. And mysticism invites us beyond all of that. And that's when we get into this idea of the formless mysticism, what the cloud of unknowing, referred to as the cloud of unknowing, that place where we have to lay down all categories and all ways of thinking about the divine. But then even beyond that is this idea of the non-dual, and this idea that we come to the point where, you know, all language falls away, all human binary categories of, this is this and that is not this, et cetera, simply fall away. And what do we have left? We have pure presence. And this is, the non-dual encounter with God, where God and I are not two. And I know a lot of people who chafe against, a lot of people in the Christian world who chafe against this idea. And they're like, no, there's always a separation between creator and creation. And I'm like, maybe on a dogmatic level, you can swim in those waters. That's fine. But I do think that contemplative practice takes us to a point where anything we can say, anything we can think, ultimately kind of collapses under its own weight. And we've entered into the singularity where everything is God and God is everything. Everything is in God and God is in everything. I like to say that Christian non-duality is like standing at the North Pole, and every direction you look is south. When you're one with God, every direction you look is something to love and something to express compassion and mercy and kindness towards. You could call that the Bodhisattva ideal as well, but I do think that's where the mystical life, even within the Christian world, ultimately takes us.
That's extremely beautiful. You have a great
Oh, thank you.
poetic way of talking. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I mean, I guess one more thing, you mentioned Ken Wilber a little bit, and I'm
Hmm.
certainly a
Hmm.
big fan of him. I'm curious just on that one point, like as far as his kind of roadmap of integral theory, where are you exactly not in agreement with him?
Well, I think I already touched on that I see it more as a spectrum than as boxes.
Okay.
And Wilbur probably would not dispute that. But I think whenever you create a taxonomy, for example, Evelyn Underhill's The Seven Mansions, the interior castle. And so what do people do? They read the interior castle and they want to figure out, well, which mansion am I in? And I just think that's like a useless exercise. And so, so trying to peg mystics, like I think I remember in his book, Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, Wilbur says, well, Meister Eckhart is a formless mystic, but Ramana Maharshi is a non-dual mystic. And I chafed against that. I thought, you misunderstand Eckhart if you don't read Eckhart as non-dual. So that's where I find myself arguing with Wilbur, is that I think you have to hold these kind of taxonomies very lightly and very gently. As the classic Zen proverb, the map is not the territory. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. And so it's important to remember that all of these maps, I mean, the AQUAL, Wilbur's kind of all quadrants, all lines, his model of the four quadrants, it's still just a map. It's still just one way to try to make sense of the phenomena of human experience. And it's a story, it's a myth, and like all myths, its relationship to truth is somewhat fluid. And, I think we have to, kind of recognize it may be a helpful myth, a useful myth. It makes sense. You can track it. That's the definition of a good myth. But, what we know, like from the structure of scientific revolutions, I mean, even the most brilliant scientific theory can, in a minute, open up to a whole new way of understanding the world and of understanding phenomena. My wife and I watched a new movie. It's just streaming right now. It's called The Heart Revolution. I don't know who made it, but it's really beautiful, and it's kind of the heart math people. It's about the intelligence of the human heart and the recognition that the heart is so much more than a pump. The heart is the second biggest concentration of neurons after the brain. And of course, then the gut is also a concentration, kind of like a grand central station of neurons as well. So, you could make the argument that the human, the organism, our physiological organism actually has three brains. The brain, the heart brain, and the belly brain, the gut brain. And that each one has its own way of knowing, its own wisdom, its own, kind of, obviously the cranium, that's cognition, that's logic, that's, you know, um, linguistics, language, syntax, et cetera, et cetera. You get into the heart and you're getting more into that realm of emotion, of intuition, of compassion, of mercy. And then you get down into the belly and it's just pure intuition. Think about, I have a hunch, I have a hunch in my gut, that kind of thing. But those are all ways of knowing. This is kind of at the cutting edge of science. In fact, in this movie, they interviewed one physician, a cardiologist, and he was just like, that's all bunk. The heart is a pump. It is a pump. That's all it is a pump. And so, that's kind of the dominant paradigm. And so, okay, some people think the heart is just a pump. That's fine. But, I have this deep intuitive sense for myself. Obviously, I'm not a scientist. I'm not doing the research. And it's just gratifying to know that there are scientists who are doing that kind of research. And some of those kind of research initiatives might be dead ends, but others could literally change the paradigm overnight. And we have a totally new way of understanding, you know, how the brain works, how our nervous system works, and the role that the heart plays in our knowing and our intelligence. So that's obviously just one example that's fresh on my mind because I watched that movie last night, but there certainly are many others. So I don't know how I got on this. How did I get on this? We were talking about Ken Wilber, but and I think the mystical life is the same way. I think when we move, out of, one level of consciousness to another level of consciousness, again, Teresa of Avila, from one mansion to another mansion, it's like a paradigm shift, and we learn to see the world in a radically new way. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we do this kind of work. Obviously, we're hungry for love, we're hungry for wisdom, we're hungry for ways in which we can be happy and be of service to others. So,
Oh, that's beautiful, Carl. That's beautiful. So I guess, as we kind of come up towards the end of this, are there some more final thoughts or final things you would like to leave our listeners with? You've said so much great stuff already, but is there a little bit more you would like to kind of conclude with?
well, I mean, clearly, given the name of this podcast, I'm assuming that most people who are listening to this are people who already have an openness to contemplative spirituality and contemplative
Yes,
practice.
for sure.
So I would say keep on keeping on. If you're new to this, I would say that, the contemplative life is um, is a profoundly beautiful way to nurture one's heart and one's soul. The beauty behind mystical or contemplative spirituality, again, it pairs well with all the traditional religions. I know so many people, maybe, they grew up in the Methodist Church or the Episcopal Church or whatever, and they have this deep rootedness in Christianity, but now they're reading Thich Nhat Hanh or Pema Chodron, or Ramana Maharshi, or they're exploring, other forms of spirituality. And I would say that the mystical life invites us into that radical sense of freedom. I mean, Jesus himself said the truth will set you free. And so recognizing that we can find truth in any context. I mean, Ignatius of Loyola used to say, seek God in all things, find God in all things. Talking about neo-paganism, finding the divine in nature, finding the divine in other human beings, finding the divine in people who are suffering, people whom we can be of service to. that's really the key here. And then all contemplation is really an orientation or a calibration. We're calibrating ourselves to that heart wisdom. We're calibrating ourselves to love, to kindness, to silence. I mean, you and I haven't even talked about silence. We could spend another half hour doing that, and the role that it plays in the mystical life. So I would just say, hey, this is a great adventure. And one last thing, I've already touched on this, but it's worth underlining. For people who have been traumatized or hurt by traditional religion, by fundamentalist religion, or religion that is exclusionary, again, exclusionary towards LGBTQ people, exclusionary towards women, um, that is exclusionary towards outsiders. You can't be saved if are a Buddhist. That's just one story, and that's not the full story of Christianity. And that if you still want, like, let's say you've been hurt by the church, but you found, so many of Jesus's teachings to be meaningful for you, then the mystical uh, the mystical path is your home, because it is the place to pair kind of a deep devotion to the wisdom from the Western tradition with a radical heart-centered openness to wisdom wherever it comes from. And also recognizing that just because an institution has the name Christian on it doesn't mean that it's infallible, that it doesn't get to hurt people, it doesn't get to traumatize people. Unfortunately, religious trauma is a real thing. And so people who've experienced that, and I understand many people experience religious trauma and they have to get as far away from religion as possible. I respect that and I honor that. That's taking good care of yourself. But for those of us who say, no, the spiritual life still matters to me, the wisdom of the past is still meaningful to me, but I don't know that I could ever just be, a garden variety Christian ever again, then explore the mystics and explore the contemplatives. So, and my watch just talked to me. So, all right. I think that was my signal to wrap up. So,
Okay, no, that's fantastic stuff. And like how you brought up a lot of good things about religious abuse too. So, real quick, before we leave, what's the best way for viewers to get in touch with you?
yes, well, of course, I am on the line. I have my website is anamcara.com. It's a Gaelic word that means soul friend. So that's A-N as in Nancy, A-M as in Mary, CHARA.com, anamcara.com. My books, of course, are available through all the major online retailers. And if you want to really get engaged with my work, support my work, and get involved in some regular meetings with me, I do have a Patreon page as well, where that is fee-based, of course, but for not a lot of money, people can connect with me and support my work. So, and that's patreon.com/Carl McColman. So,
Well, fantastic, Carl. It's been so great having you here, and thanks for all of your wisdom and all of what you've offered our viewers. I think they will take some great things away from it.
well, thank you for your work and for inviting me on. It's been a joy.
All righty, take care.